Hi everyone, Colin here with Team Align, and today I'd like to share a few things that I've learned over the years to help get some extra longevity out of the parts and components on your Tier 700, your 800, and also all of the smaller Align helicopters. I would say most people who are flying on the weekend as a hobby probably only do between 5 and 10 flights a day, 2 times a week. But if you're keen, you're trying to learn quickly, maybe you're out at the field 4 or 5 times a week and you're flying between 15 and 20 flights a day. If that's the case, you might notice that over a certain time span, we'll say a month, your parts aren't lasting as long as they would if you were doing fewer amount of flights in that given time. So the parts are certainly lasting their life expectancy that they were given during the design process, but over time, if you're doing a huge number of flights, obviously you want to take some measures that are going to help your components last as long as they possibly can. So with that said, we'll zoom in with the camera and we'll have a look at all of the components individually, and I can share with you some of the tips and tricks that we at the team have learned over the last couple of years to get the most life out of all of our components. One of the things I see many people overlooking is applying a very little bit of oil between every flying session, between the spherical bushing and your main shaft. That's a surface that your swash plate is going to travel up and down on, and eventually over time, if you don't oil it, depending on where you're flying, it may take a certain amount of time, but you're going to accumulate dust and dirt and crud from the flying site that will slowly cause this bushing to bind up against the main shaft. And like I say, you're not going to notice it right away because your servos, of course, are providing a little bit of resistance for when you move them by your finger for the swash plate travel up and down on the main shaft. Eventually, what's going to happen is your servos are going to have to work extremely hard, causing them to get very hot and draw an excessive amount of current from your battery. So you run the risk of crashing the model, over draining a battery because you don't notice that the actual spherical bushing right here is binding on the main shaft. And all it takes is, I would say, once a weekend or at the beginning of every flying session is just a little drop of generic 3-in-1 multi-purpose oil. It doesn't have to be anything particular or anything expensive. Any general 3-in-1 oil will work, and like I say, just one little drop between flying sessions will keep that nice and free. So one drop up at the top, you can let it wick in there, move the swash plate up and down a few times to make sure that it's getting the whole surface area of your swash plate and your main shaft, and you're good to go. The second spot you should be applying oil is between your tail rotor shaft and the bushing that rides along it. This is a very similar scenario as on your main shaft, where eventually over time it's going to accumulate dust and dirt that's going to cause it to bind up. So one little drop of 3-in-1 oil between flying sessions is all it takes to keep that nice and free. So you'll apply the drop of oil and then cycle the tail rotor control mechanism through its travel a couple times to make sure that it's wicked into all the areas. One area that is a little bit opposite of what I've always learned is applying a small amount of grease to your plastic tail rotor gears. Now, most people will argue the other way, that plastic gears are self-lubricating and that you shouldn't apply any grease because it's going to attract even more dust and dirt and cause them to wear out faster. But in my experience over the last few years, I've actually noticed the opposite. What happens with these gears, because they're running at such a high RPM, is they eventually create their own dust, and that dust, once it sits in between all the teeth, starts to act like sandpaper, causing the gear to erode away even faster than it would if you had a slight amount of lubricant, stopping the dust from the gears meshing together to have been created in the first place. Using the clear silicone Align grease that comes with their kits, but if you do so choose to use your own alternative, you may find something that ends up working a little bit better, like I have here, which is just a small tub of wheel bearing grease. So once again, don't shy away from using the stuff that's included in the kit. It does work. It's certainly better than leaving them dry, but I've personally found this alternative, which is just a wheel bearing grease, to work a little bit better. Applying the grease to the gears is very simple. It only requires an extremely small amount, just enough on the end of your fingertip to push in between the teeth on both bevel gears. So I would go every quarter rotation on each gear to make sure that it's saturated enough that there's no dry spots in the gear. Once you've got the grease applied, simply rotate the tail rotor shaft a few times to cycle and make sure that both gears are evenly coated with the grease. If you see a spot that's a little bit dry or it's taking too long to get wet with the grease, simply grab another small amount on your fingertip, locate the dry spot, and apply it by hand. And that is literally all it takes. And I typically do that maybe twice a year. As well as providing some longevity to these gears, it also quiets down the model a little bit once it gets broken in. That said, you still need to inspect your gears for wear. An indication that the gears are getting worn is when you look at the back side, you'll notice that the teeth become sharp and pointed. From the manufacturer, the teeth are square at the top. Once those begin to get pointy, you'll notice a significant amount of backlash between these two bevel gears, and you know it's time to change them. Now that the grease is worked in, you can see that the teeth are evenly coated with a very, very small amount of grease. I also recommend doing this to the bevel gears in your front tail rotor transmission that's driven from your auto gear below the main gear. That will also, just like it does to these rear tail rotor gears, cause them to last almost twice as long as they would if you weren't applying any grease at all. While we're on the topic of greasing components, I'd like to touch base on the thrust bearings in both the main rotor grips and our tail rotor grips. These need to be regularly maintained. About 2 or 3 times of the year, you should take them apart and then pack the thrust bearing full of grease, much like we did with the tail rotor gears, but with significantly more grease. You want to fill up the ball race with grease and then both the cups, so when you push them together, a small amount of grease oozes out from the outside diameter of that bearing. And then when you install it back into the rotor grip, you want to make sure that there's no grease remaining on the inside of the grip, so that when you push the radial bearing in, you apply a little bit of red or green Loctite. That Loctite will adhere to the surface between the bearing and the grip. Here we've got a new thrust bearing with the outer cup and the inner cup. We want to make sure that the inner cup faces the ball side of the bearing like that once it's greased. That way when it's in the rotor head, centrifugal force won't pull the grease as easily through this side of the bearing. You can simply apply the grease by hand just like we did with the tail rotor gears. You want to make sure that all the cavities between each rotating ball is full with grease. At this point, it doesn't have to look neat and tidy. Once we push the two cups together is when we'll wipe off the excess grease on the inner part and the outer part of the bearing. So that's the bearing coated. Now we need to do both cups. So as you can see right there, the outside of the bearing's still dirty. We want to make sure, I shouldn't say dirty, but there's still grease on it, and we want to make sure that that's all clean before we drop it into the grip. So that way when we put the radial bearing in front of this, there's no grease preventing the Loctite to adhering between the outer race of the radial bearing and the inside of the grip. That's all I've got for very few preventative maintenance tips. The model's extremely reliable out of the box as it is. You don't have to do any of this if you don't choose to. But obviously, doing a little bit of maintenance is going to allow your line parts to last as long as they absolutely can. Regardless of anything you do, you should always have a little bit of 3-in-1 oil on your main shaft and tail rotor shaft to prevent them from binding up, as they do over time accumulate a little bit of dirt and grime, just the nature of flying outside. Like I say, the tail rotor gear grease and your thrust bearing grease every few months is certainly going to help, but it's not 100% necessary. So once again, thank you for watching the video, and as always, if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email.